Sometimes God's trying to talk to us and we are having a hard time trying to listen. There's a couple of reasons for this. One of the reasons genuinely might be that it's the wrong time, that actually God's got something to say, but he's not going to say it to us right now, and so he's just on mute. Mostly, for me, it's the noise that I put around myself. It's my schedule, my diary, my very, very important meetings that I fill my life with, my being with family and friends, and my music and my TV and my hobbies and the food I need to buy and the things I need to get and planning for things and going to sleep and waking up and walking the dog and all of the things that fill my life that I put as priorities to stopping and finding a secret place and listening to God. And maybe sometimes for me it's also been that I haven't wanted to hear what he's got to say. Sometimes I feel like perhaps in the background I did know perfectly well what God was trying to say to me, and I was terrified of, if he is saying this, what are the consequences? How am I going to deal with what it is he's actually saying? So years and years ago, there was a religious leader called Saul. He was a Pharisee, which means a leader in the Jewish church. And he was like super passionate. Okay, so he wanted to get it right. He wanted to do it perfectly. He wanted to worship God with everything he had. And so he interpreted that as, I must get all the rules right for God. I want to do worship excruciatingly, painstakingly, correctly. So much so that he fought and fought and fought to be underneath his mentor, who was called Gamaliel. Gamaliel was like top in the Jewish leadership. This fantastic guy that was super well respected everywhere. Because Saul was underneath Gamaliel, Saul was progressing faster than anyone else his age at being like really, really high up in the Jewish faith. Now, his mentor Gamaliel said a very interesting thing once. The Jewish leaders were trying to figure out what they should do with this new cult they called the Way, which later on would be called Christians. They were throwing them in jail and beating them up and flogging them because what they thought they were doing was so anti-God. But Gamaliel stood up in the middle of the group of them and he said this: listen guys, do you remember a while ago there was this group that sprung up from nowhere and actually it wasn't from God and it all fizzled out? Well, my recommendation is we leave these guys alone. If it's not from God, the same thing will happen. But if it is from God, we will just find ourselves fighting against God, and that doesn't work. Remember that phrase. We will find ourselves fighting against God. So Saul, the guy who's under Gamaliel, he is very passionate about persecuting these followers of the Way, which now are called Christians. And they start popping up all over the place. So he gets letters of permission from certain leaders that he can go and find them. So he's going from house to house, breathing out murderous threats and sometimes imprisoning Christians and confiscating their property, stoning them, all kinds of different things. Now one day he's on this road from where he is to a place called Damascus. And this is what happens. He's on his way and suddenly a bright light from heaven pours down on him and there's a voice, and the people with him can hear the voice but they can't understand it. but Saul can hear it. And the voice says this to him: Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul says, who are you? And the voice says, it's me, Jesus, the one that you are persecuting. I mean, it just must have blown Saul's mind totally. The writer of Acts adds in an extra line and reveals that Jesus also said to him, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. Goads were like mini spears, and if you were trying to get a piece of a cattle from one place to another to where the cattle should be, you could take this spear and you could ram it into the hide of the cattle, so that the cattle would actually go to where it was supposed to go. And sometimes the cattle would kick back at that spear and harm itself in the process of the farmer trying to do the best thing and get the cattle to where it needed to be. And Jesus says that to Saul. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. In other words, I'm trying to get you to the right place, and you know I've been trying to get you to the right place, and the pain you're feeling is me. The noise that must have been going on in Saul's head must have been absolutely huge. I mean, he knew that hearing that would have been against his particular brand of Jewish culture. He also knew that it was what Jesus stood for, and what the followers of the way stood for were nowhere near his traditional orthodox position. They were welcoming people and doing things that in his eyes the Jewish laws and customs said were abhorrent, and he would also have to say goodbye to his career path and his friends and his mentors. It would be a huge upheaval if he accepted what he felt God was saying to him. But in the end, he does accept it. So what does he do? What does Saul do? He takes himself away. He takes himself away into Arabia, and he asks God to speak to him one-to-one. And then he takes himself back into Damascus, the very place with the people that he was going to persecute. And when he gets to Damascus, he stays there for a long, long time. What a humble man Saul turns out to be. I wonder, I feel like God is much more willing to speak to us than we are ready to listen. I feel like there's probably more often something that God wants to say that he's on my case about already that I don't want to listen to. Maybe it's a challenge to the level of my faith, maybe it's a challenge to the reality of God at work in my life. Maybe it's a question or an opinion that I have that needs to be revolutionized, that I've settled with, but actually it's not what God wants, and I need to change my opinion on something. For me, that's a hard thing to get my head round. Maybe I'm afraid to hear it because I'm afraid actually of the consequences of the answer. Maybe there's something that you know that God is already gnawing away at you, but you're afraid, like Saul was, like I've been, because the consequences of you hearing and accepting what he's saying are too big. So you fill your life with noise, legitimately good things that you're doing for God and for the community, but actually God is trying to slow you down and say something to you. So we need to do what Saul did. We need to find a secret space that we can go to and stop and listen one-to-one, just us and God. Sometimes it's a retreat space, sometimes it's an empty kitchen. For me, it's like a bath or a walk in a glen or a cave somewhere, sometimes a drive, but somewhere non-disturbable, where God can speak and you can say, God, I surrender. I surrender. So may we find our own secret places. May we take the time to remove the noise and come to God and listen. And may we have the courage to hear those things that maybe God has already been speaking to us about, but the consequences are so big, we've not had the courage yet to say, yes, I surrender. Lord, would you teach us to surrender?